Hey everybody, this video is called The Midianites Defeated, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study in the book of Judges, where we're going to look at the 7th chapter, where we're going to look at the battle against Midian. So, chapter 7, verse 1 through 3 says, Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, My own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, Whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So those of faith, though inadequate by human weakness, gained victory only through the supernatural power of God. And 300 men won against an incredible Midianite host. And God gains the glory by making the outcome standing out his act, and no sinful pride is acquired. In verse 4 through 8 says, But the Lord said to Gideon, The people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, This one shall go with you, the same shall go with you, and of whomever I say to you, This one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, Everyone who laps from the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down to their knees to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, By the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. So the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands. So he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it to your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah your servant. So God had already reduced Gideon's army from 32,000 to 10,000. And here he reduces it even more significantly from 10,000 to 300. And 10,000 were too many for God's purpose. And soldiers who lapped as a dog, scooping water with their hands as a dog does with its tongue, were chosen, while those who sank to their knees to drink were rejected. And no reason for such distinction is given, so that it showed nothing about their ability as soldiers. And it was practically a way to divide the crowd. And their abilities as soldiers had no bearing on the victory in any sort of way, since the enemy soldiers killed themselves and fled without engaging Gideon's men at all. And Gideon had to trust God for the victory. And I know I read verses 9 and 10. We're going to read verse 11 as well. It says, And you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. So God wanted Gideon to find encouragement in this visit to the enemy's camp. And God sensitively recognized Gideon's normal fear, since he was the commander. And God encouraged him to take his servant as protection. And we see the tender mercy of God as he deals with Gideon's doubts and the fears of Gideon. But God wanted to reassure him that God would be with him. And so, verse 12 through 15 says, Now the Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. And when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. He said, I have had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. Then his companion answered and said, This is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. So we see a vision that showed the camp of the Midianites would be knocked over by a person that was a nobody, but they were humbled. And only the very poor ate barely bread. And Gideon's encouragement was contagious as he even spread it to others. And God also said in verse 9, he said, Arise. In verse 9 it says, It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. And in verse 16 through 18 it says, Then he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet into every man's hand, with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, Look at me and do likewise. Watch, and when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp, and say to the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So the trumpets and torches at first concealed within the clay pitchers were suddenly displayed at the most startling moment. And the impression caused by blaring noise, the always terrible shouts of Israel, as in Numbers 23:21, and sudden lights surrounding the sleeping host and shattering the stillness conveyed one idea. And each light could mean a legion behind it, so they believed that an incredible host had to move in to catch the awakening army in the death trap. And in verse 18 was the power of God in harmony with the obedience of man. And such shouts reminded the enemies that the threat of the sword of Gideon and of God was for real. And the impression was one of doom and terror. And it's a very strange battle plan. But verse 19 through 23 says, So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outposts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just as they had posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers. They held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing. And they cried, and the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And every man stood in his place all around the camp, and the whole army ran and cried out and fled. When the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp. And the army fled to Beth Acacia toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Mahola by Tabath. And the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, and of Manasseh, and pursued the Midianites. So the beginning middle watch was approximately at 10 p.m. at night. And God struck the Midianite army with a surprise attack as they woke to an explosive noise with light and movement coming down on them from all directions. And panic would lead into shock. And that would make sense because it hits them out of nowhere. You ever get hit with a shock moment where not necessary news, but you hear a loud bang? We just had the 4th of July last week or a couple weeks ago, whatever. And the fireworks, sometimes when you're outside and you go for a walk at night, you get random fireworks that shoot off. And especially if you live in the hood, you never know if it's gunshots or fireworks. But every soldier was on his own in a desperate retreat. And in the darkness and the crash of the sounds, the soldiers were unable to distinguish friend from enemy. And with their swords, they slashed a path of escape through their own men. And the battle wasn't between Israel and Midian, but truly it was friendly fighting where the Midianites fought themselves. In verse 24-25 it says, Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth-barah in the Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized the watering places as far as Beth-barah in the Jordan. And they captured 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeeb they killed at the winepress of Zeeb. They pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. So God blessed the effort of the people of Ephraim, and they made good success against the enemy and their leaders. So to wrap up this chapter, God tells Gideon to tell all his soldiers who were afraid to go home. If you're a soldier and you are afraid to go to war, then you're in the wrong business. You can't go to war with fear that you aren't willing to lay down your life if need be. And that still happens in the militaries today. You'll see people that sign up for the Army and they don't make it through boot camp because they're not fit to be. And it reminded me of when I was an MP. We also had people that were afraid to get out of the car to do a traffic stop. And it's like, what are you doing in the Army if you're afraid to do a traffic stop and get out of the car? Yes, there is risk that you might get shot at or whatever could go down. But you signed up for the job, you got to get it done. And Israel's small army is too big for God to use practically. And Gideon was committed to send home those who were afraid because they were useless. And Gideon was to separate the men according to a particular test. And one of the lessons that we should get out of today's chapter is sometimes big does not mean better, but it can be a hindrance. And if I put 15 people into my Toyota Sienna van, it's not gonna be better in regards to the fuel economy. My fuel economy is probably gonna go down to, a Bronco level, 10 miles on the highway or something if I have 15 people in a 8-passenger van. But if I put 15 people in my van, it would create a more fuel economic situation, and it would actually result in more fuel being used. So in the end, I'm probably not saving fuel compared to if, we took my Toyota Camry and we took another, Prius, like my mother-in-law's Prius, for a group of, obviously you can't fit 15 people in there. Unless you're in the Army, then you can always fit one more. But you get the drift. Just because I can fit 8 people in the van doesn't mean to take one vehicle with 15 people and squeeze everybody on the floors and in the back and all that to try to save gas, because you're not really going to save gas. Maybe it's a bad analogy. That's okay as well, I guess. But I want to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 through 10. And this is the Apostle Paul speaking here. He says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may test upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, I am strong. So Paul was in the danger zone, and he was being too strong for his own good, and therefore God brought weakness into his life so that Paul had to keep relying on the Lord. And strength and be stronger than ever was only through the Lord. And so Gideon must spy on the camp of the Midianites, we saw as well, and find encouragement. And we see the tenderness, mercy of God. And God reassured Gideon through the Midianites. And God used this situation to build the faith of Gideon. And it worked out so well that all Gideon could do was worship God, and knowing that his enemies were to be afraid of him. And sometimes we go through different life situations, and that's to build us in our walks. It's to build us in our faith, to trust in God, because God is the God of the impossible. And we saw Gideon announce a strange battle plan, as the army was already small enough to be used by God to win the battle. But, all you need is God, and you got victory. And God struck the Midianite army with a surprise attack. In the chapter, it ends with the working towards total defeat of Midian. And that's going to wrap up this chapter today. We are 1/3 of the way through the book of Judges. So I hope you have a great rest of your night. We'll see you next time in chapter 8, as we're going to look at the pursuit after Midian. So have a great rest of your night. God bless.